Hello and welcome to Recyclist. I'm your host, Eric Provost, and today I'm being joined by a very special guest. And I would like to welcome to the show right now the National Program Manager for Farnsworth Group, Mr. Matt Cale. Thank you so much for joining me today, Matt.
Thanks. It's a pleasure, Eric. I'm happy to be here.
Just very quickly, kind of off the bat, for those who may terribly not be familiar, what is the Farnsworth Group?
Sure. So we're a fairly traditional architecture and engineering company. We do anything you could need to do in terms of consulting on in the construction industry, both the vertical side of it and the horizontal side of it. So site development and architecture, engineering, and all the services that surround those kind of things.
Nice. And as the company's national program manager, what is it that you do? What is it you oversee? What is your primary function within the company?
Sure. So my background is in mechanical engineering, but I've also studied a lot of sustainability and have a lot of experience around energy consulting on the consumption side of things. And my role within the firm is to kind of take all those other things that I mentioned, the horizontal and vertical services that we do, and kind of find the through line and say, this is how we implement these best practices to help our clients get the most out of their buildings in terms of performance and sustainability and reporting.
Hmm. And I am wondering, you talked about, your career kind of very briefly there and your way up. What do you feel like are some of the key differences in your view as the industry now? Having to see such kind of the big picture of it versus when you were an associate or a program manager earlier on in your career, because you've spent time with multiple engineering groups across your company, so you've seen a lot of this industry at this point, both from the regular associate level and now as the senior program manager. How has your view of the industry morphed and evolved over the years?
Yeah, so it's interesting because I think I'm also of a certain age. I think a lot of people might call it the exennial generation, where we still remember coming up with dial-up modem, and then we've seen obviously
Oh
what we
yeah,
have today in terms of the access
that
to data.
screeching sound from AOL still keeps me up at night.
That's exactly right. Yep, it's still every once in a while you'll hear the echo and you just look around. But I think it's analogous because, I think when I was early in my career, you could do a lot of offline and deep analysis with some of the tools that we had. And obviously, we had great modeling softwares and things like that, but you were very much working kind of in a silo and, generating data for your design and trying to make decisions based on that data. But obviously in a vacuum and in a smaller scale. And now, with the ability to kind of not just connect with communities, but also like share your data, share your results, and talk about things at a much faster rate. You just have such great access to doing database decision making and being able to do it in real time and efficiently. Whereas it used to be a much heavier lift to get to a specific metric you were looking for a design or for an analysis.
And now, as the national program manager and overseeing so many, individual projects and working with so many other engineers on their projects and seeing much more the full umbrella of what's going on, is there anything that you see at this point in your career from the big picture aspect that maybe would have helped you, something you would have liked to have known when you were working on your individual projects earlier on in your career?
Oh yeah, sure. Some younger associates that come in right now, have this entire other skill set that I tried with some failure earlier in my career to develop. Like, I have a young PhD candidate on my team now who will just, I'll ask him to solve a problem for me or analyze some data, and he'll go, "Well, just write a quick Python script and throw that down, and then that'll clean up the data for us, and we'll have the answer pretty quick." And that's like something I would have, grinded through a spreadsheet for a month on to try to figure it out. And he's just got this different way of thinking about things because he's come up in a different time, right?
Yeah.
So it would have been great to be a little bit more literate in fast and easy code writing than I ended up being.
Well, speaking of literate for the non-engineers out there, what was Python just a piece of engineering software that you guys use?
Yeah, it's just a piece of code. Back in my day, we would write. I would write something with a computer code called BASIC, and nowadays, and then it became, the things came out like C++, and now the
Yeah.
most open source one is just a compiler called Python. So that's all it is.
You guys actually use C++ in engineering? I thought that was just for computer programming college courses.
Well, that's what they tried to teach me and it didn't stick. So, but no, I don't know. We really never got that. It wasn't very conducive to what we were trying to do. That's why the more lightweight stuff nowadays is becoming more useful.
Would you say the software evolution has been kind of the biggest aspect, the biggest thing pushing the industry forward at this point, just from where computer software was at when you started your career versus where we're at now here in 2025?
I think so. I mean, really, that just it just makes decision making a lot easier, a lot more lightweight. For instance, I used to have to, if I wanted to draw a plan of a room, I would have to lay it out on a floor plan and then manually think about and visualize what it would look like in an elevation, standing up, right, from a different perspective. And now everything is drawn in 3 dimensions and put in building information models where you can literally fly through and walk through a building with every bit of something that's going to be in there sort of visualized for you as opposed to having to visualize it in your head.
Yeah. Outside of the software, have there been any big kind of evolutionary steps forward for the industry? Anything that you're happy that is in place or happy that is around now that you didn't have?
Yeah, I think not just the software side of it, but I think there's a big movement toward transparency in reporting. For instance, there's a lot of movement in legislatures and local jurisdictions around uh, building owners having to report out and be transparent about how much energy they're using. Sort of like, we're even getting to places in some jurisdictions where an owner will have to put something analogous to the food safety scorecard you've seen in the window of a restaurant, right?
Yeah.
And now that's having to be reported. So in terms of that kind of stuff, that's I think a good thing overall. Is just there's a lot more just acceptance that like we gotta always try to do better on how much we're using, right?
And I'm glad you brought up the legislative aspect of it because I definitely wanted to get into that because when it comes to all the industries that we work with and we service, engineering and creating whole new structures, there's a ton of governmental regulation and different laws and bylaws and things that you guys need to worry about at every aspect of it. I can't even imagine navigating that minefield. But you would it be fair to say that you think it's much easier to navigate it now in your career?
Well, I think so because we have access to the information.
Okay.
It's something we wouldn't always have had. For instance, the traditional model would have been if you're going to embark on designing a new building as an architect, 20 years ago, and say it's a fairly substantial structure with a lot of
Hmm.
dollars and eyeballs attached to it. The general model, used to be that you would have a big national company come in and be the lead architect who had built something like that before and had all the credentials. But then you'd also have sort of the local architects in support and on the team who just knew the people and knew what the jurisdiction wanted and how they were going to interpret the codes, right? Because there's the whole what's written and then there's the how is it implemented side of
Yeah.
things. And now, that certainly still is the case, but I think it's becoming less and less of a thing.
When it comes to, you know, it's just sticking with the regulation for a second. Have there been anything recently? Because I know obviously the country's just gone through a pretty big administration shift, and from our aspect, there's already rumblings of implementing new regulations or releasing regulations from the EPA that may have some significant impact on the landfill and RNG industry. Are you guys seeing any of that in kind of just core engineering?
Yeah, yeah, we certainly are. I mean, there's things like now I should say, we're fortunate in that we tend to be a little more, state and local government as opposed to federal government.
Yeah,
So that doesn't always work in lockstep, right? And or is slower to react to the macro trends. But there are all kinds of interesting things that are intuitive and counterintuitive. There, for instance, in some places that we work, not only is it mandatory to report what your energy looks like, to the transparent public, but also there's even more of a stick and less of a carrot approach where this is what your use is, and you have to get better on this timeline. Otherwise, there's going to be some kind of penalty on
Yeah.
your local tax bill, right? And so that's become a thing, and that's the direction a lot of places are going, right?
So when it comes to the regulation, is there anything that any aspect of governmental or even local regulations that you think should be addressed to maybe shore up some potential vulnerabilities within the industry or make things needless or prevent things from being needlessly annoying when you're trying to get projects off the ground? Do you think there's anything currently out there that you feel like should be addressed?
Yeah, I always think, there's always the disconnect between policy and execution, right? So if we're
Yeah.
going to have these policies where you have to get better, it's always better if they're coupled with, some kind of funding mechanism, right? Yes, you got to get better, but also here's access to a low interest loan, or here's some funding from your tax dollars that help you get that done, because there's not always that. There's always like, hey, it's always the chance of your building is not running efficiently. Do something about it, and the owner could definitely be in a situation, well, how am I supposed to capitalize that, right? Where
Yeah.
am I supposed to? What resources do I have to make that happen?
Well, when you see customers, when you see clients run into situations like that, uh, because I'm sure a lot of them wouldn't really know how to approach that because that's obviously much more your wheelhouse. For the people out there who may run into to issues like that, what advice would you give them?
Yeah, and that's a perfect segue into a project we did not too long ago. This was for Children's Hospital up in Wisconsin. And so, we know that all these things happen, and there's nothing connecting, the need for something to the funding source for it. So when we're asked to come in and consult on something like that, we always try to talk in terms of dollars at every turn. And so that means things like we might go to your facility and recommend a bunch of measures that would save energy and save dollars, and that's a fairly standard engineering exercise. But then the program side of it is we would then take that and organize that for the client in a way that gets the most dollars into the program on the front end, and then help them do the economics and say, like, if you save the most money now, then that helps capitalize your program over time. And also, we're going to monitor that so that you end up with this piggy bank and self-funding mechanism, right? Just with some simple economics and interest and things like that. Little things like a dollar today is always better than a dollar in 5 years, so we should get that as soon as we can. And if you sort of sort that against an entire array of possible projects a client could do, it really makes a difference over time at them being able to hit those benchmarks and hit the performance targets they're looking for.
And when it comes to clients who uh, want maybe a small project versus a larger project, where do you think a lot of the biggest issues come from? Do you think it's in the more direct, more focused jobs, or do you think it's in the more expansive jobs?
I think it's definitely in the more direct jobs. There's there's always a thing in our industry that we refer to as deferred maintenance. I don't know if you're
Hmm.
familiar with that or not, but and the analogy I like to make is, even in your own home, there's 100 or more things that are cost money at a certain point in time
Yeah.
and to buy, and then cost money over time to maintain. And generally speaking, there's always something that falls behind. You don't have the ability to spend money on it, or you just don't for whatever reason, to make sure that all of that preventive maintenance is happening. And that happens in the biggest of facilities too. So almost everything we run into is some form of maintenance dollars being deferred over time. And that's in every existing facility everywhere.
Yeah.
So, on the new construction side of things, if we're building a new building, then obviously that's not as big of a deal. But when we're building something like that, we like to say, like, well, why do those things happen? And it's because maybe they weren't maintainable. You weren't able to get at that piece of equipment and do the service on it because it was crammed into a closet or above a ceiling. And so that's where we say, if it's not maintainable, it's not sustainable, because it's going to drift over time. You can't get the performance out of it. You can't do the things you need to do to stay ahead of that deferred maintenance curve.
Actually, that uh, brings up an interesting point for me because I'm sure across your career you've dealt with customers and clients who have come to you or come to one of the engineers that you work with and said, "Hey, for our site, for our industry, for our purposes, we need X, and we need a building or structure that can do X." And you look at it from an engineering perspective, and you say that's actually not what you need. You need something else.
Mhm.
Has that ever anything like that ever really occurred where they say we need a building that's designed like this, and you've come in on the back end and said that's actually not really going to be sustainable or that's not going to be right?
Yeah, it happens all the time, and we call that early stage, either workshopping or schematic narratives, or depending on where we're coming at a project from. Sometimes we develop a document called Owner's Project Requirements,
Hmm.
which is a very simple version of what you just said. It's not a complicated engineering narrative. It's, let's just say, 20 pages of here's what I want. I want to write it down. I want to put it all in front of everybody so that I can get all my thoughts in one place and organize it. And then we can iterate on that and we say, well, do you really need that? Why do you need that? And then we try to organize the conversation that way around the client's needs, because there are all kinds of misconceptions of they think they need this system or this kind of thing just because that's what they've been told or that's what their experience is with or that's what they're comfortable with, when they may not be aware of a new technology or a new way of doing things or an alternative. So, but as long as we have that sort of single source of truth document, then we can always kind of keep going back to that and be, remember, we wanted this. Do we still want that? Or is it now this? And you can kind of track the changes over time there. So we try to approach it that way.
That makes sense. The conversation would go essentially similarly to how I imagine a conversation would go with homeowners,
Hmm.
for all intents and purposes. Like, hey, we're looking for a 2 bedroom, 3 bath. We need an outside patio, and then the realtors come back and say, okay, well, we'll try to fit in. Do you really need the patio? And just kind of go from there. Just essentially that, just on a slightly larger scale, effectively.
Yep, that's right. And then, which one of those things is more important? Is the third bathroom or the patio more important
Yeah,
to you? What do you need? Right.
yeah. I would definitely take the patio because I don't think anybody needs 3 bathrooms personally, but that's neither here nor there. Matt, I am very much looking forward to continuing this conversation, which we will do in the next episode of Recyclist. So, to all of our listeners out there, make sure you tune into that. But do me a favor, before you go, make sure to check out Diamond Scientific, an industry leader in gas analysis, instrumentation, and solutions. You can check them out online at diamondsci.com. That's diamondsci.com. Or you can even set up a personalized presentation by calling 321 223 7500. Once again, my name is Eric Provost, and we will see you back here next week for another brand new episode of Recyclist. Thank you.